So this next story we have is what we've taken to calling the Duc d'Anville story. And to properly tell it, we actually have to go all the way back to 1746. And this was before the city of Halifax, as we see here today, was actually founded. In 1746, there was one large interesting event that did happen here. What was happening at the time was France and Britain were at war with each other, which was more or less a constant during this era of history. But what France wanted to do is send this huge invasion fleet across the North Atlantic. They had about 15,000 soldiers on board. They were going to sail across the North Atlantic and land in what they knew as the Chebucto Harbor, but what we now know as the Halifax Harbor. A few things went wrong during this expedition. The original plan, as I said, was to sail across the Atlantic. They were to land here, meet up with a force from Quebec, and then they would go and seize these big cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and so on, that at the time the British still owned. Now, living in real life, we know that this didn't work. But why it didn't work is interesting in its own right. As they were sailing across the North Atlantic, numerous things went wrong. There was outbreaks of disease, there was a shortage of supplies, they had bad weather conditions that ended up blowing a lot of their ships off course, and they had to spend a lot of extra time actually getting here. But by the time they did get here, they've lost about 5,000 soldiers before they even made landfall. They're already down a third of their original force. But they do make it here, and they immediately set up their camp, and their camp stretches from what's now just about Lower Water Street all the way to Bedford. There's this one massive row of tents all the way to Bedford from just down the waterline. As the journals and reports that these soldiers were writing describes, the man in charge, a man named Admiral Duc d'Anville, he made his headquarters on the very peak of the largest hill westwards of the water, which we now nowadays as Citadel Hill, and the peak of Citadel Hill before the fort was built was none other than where we're standing right now. While they were here, and they're making their camp, that force from Quebec I mentioned shows up next, and they're in just as bad of a state themselves, and they turn back around and head home. More soldiers from that original expedition from France are still dying while they're here, including Admiral Duc d'Anville himself, who died in his headquarters. Which means that one of us here tonight might be standing where Admiral Duc d'Anville died. He was then buried on George's Island, and then the rest of the force, the remaining 5,000, they packed up and went home. And how many of them actually made it home? I don't have an exact number, but I'm not very optimistic. Now, going forward to about the late 1850s, there was a lot of reports of one particular sighting here in Halifax. At this point, newspapers were a booming business in the area, and in dozens of different newspapers reported by hundreds of people, there was the same event described. People said that they saw this eerie fog creep in from the mouth of the harbor inwards, so going out from that way towards us. And as it started to engulf George's Island and Fort Charlotte, they saw someone walking around out there. Someone wearing this elaborate uniform that would be, well, way fancier than anything the Royal Artillery would have been wearing on the island, who would have been the personnel responsible for the island. They would have been dressed just about how I'm dressed tonight, and the described uniform had a lot more gold and lace on it, which is something that they would not have been wearing. So he definitely stuck out, is what I'm trying to say. And as the fog rolled in more, and the harbor, or the island rather, was fully engulfed, they say that this figure walked into the water, and as the fog engulfed the waterfront itself, this man appeared there as well. And then he walked around the waterfront, pale, non-responsive, where eventually he found his way back to the water, and with him the fog dissipated. Now, many people believe that that is either the apparition of Duc d'Anville, or perhaps one of Halifax's earliest urban legends, or maybe just a case of mass hysteria. But what's absolutely true, and what is actually more unsettling to me personally is the aftermath of that expedition I described earlier. It was just roughly 3 years after that force left was when the first settlers of Halifax showed up here. And they would have been fed propaganda for months and months now, being told things like, the king wants you to live here, this is a beautiful, beautiful area. Most importantly of all, the king wants you to live here. But then the first thing that they saw when they got here was a dozen shipwrecks and thousands of skeletons lying across the waterfront.